Hi, folks, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead for ReadyCare. So today what we're going to be looking at is cholesterol and why cholesterol in and of itself is not the problem. So we're just going to be looking at the hypothesis or questioning the hypothesis that says that cholesterol is a problem. Cholesterol in and of itself is just there in your body to clog up your arteries. And if you eat dietary cholesterol, it'll somehow adversely affect your blood serum cholesterol levels and so your risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, and so on. So we'll be looking at what's known as the lipid heart hypothesis, which is a hypothesis put forward initially by a physiologist by the name of Ansel Keys back in the late 60s, early 70s, who said that cholesterol and saturated fat may be at the root cause of heart disease, and that's what's clogging up your arteries, based on what we refer to as correlative epidemiological data, so showing a correlation between two things, i.e. people who eat the most saturated fat and cholesterol get the most heart disease. The problem with epidemiology is that it can't prove causation. It shows the connection between two things and never shows causation. It just implies a correlation between the two and signifies that there may be a reason to do further research in the area, but it can't prove causation. Okay, let me just share a couple of slides here for a second. This is just to give you a little bit of confidence in the approach we'll be taking. These are some of the results we've seen around cholesterol. So we tend to see a reduction in triglycerides, an improvement in triglycerides are just fats in your blood, by the way. An improvement in HDL, high density lipoprotein, commonly referred to as good cholesterol, and many other cardiometabolic markers. So things like blood pressure, blood sugar control, weight around the midsection, all getting significantly better. Eating less processed food and more of the stuff that we would have been told in years gone by might be bad for us. So your saturated fat, your creams, your butters, your red meat, and so on. This is an award we won from the American Heart Association for our work in primary care for the results we saw on things like cholesterol, blood sugar levels, type 2 diabetes, all that sort of stuff. Okay, I'll just glance over this very, very quickly, but essentially the lipid heart hypothesis, which we'll all be familiar with, attempted to draw a correlation between saturated fat and cholesterol and the prevalence of heart disease. Now, it's called the lipid, which is fats, heart hypothesis for a reason. It's not called the lipid heart model because it was and still remains a hypothesis. There's not too many people that believe in it anymore, but unfortunately our current guidelines were built based on the idea that saturated fat and cholesterol was a bad thing. Now, more recent studies have shown that LDLP, so things like your HDL number, your triglyceride number, your weight around the midsection, they're all much better indicators of cardiovascular risk. And total cholesterol is not a good indicator of cardiovascular risk. So this is really interesting, but a paper has come out over the last couple of years that showed that LDL cholesterol, and ignore the title there, I'll break it down in a second. LDL cholesterol, which stands for low density lipoprotein. So low density lipoprotein was commonly referred to incorrectly in the past as bad cholesterol because we thought the higher that was, the higher your risk of cardiovascular disease. So we've all been told this. The doctor has pointed to it on a report many times for a lot of us and said, your LDL cholesterol is a little bit high and your total cholesterol is high as a result. Now, this paper has shown a lack of association and an inverse association between LDL cholesterol and mortality, meaning the higher your so-called bad cholesterol, excuse me, the lower your risk of heart disease. And this comes from something called the Women's Health Initiative study. This wasn't a small study by any stretch of the imagination. This was the largest publicly funded study of all time when it comes to health. 720 million it cost, done over 20 or 30 years. And this showed actually, particularly in the females, that over the age of 60 in particular, the higher your LDL cholesterol, the lower your risk of heart disease. And you see the very bottom line here says, our analysis provides reason to question the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis, which is the lipid heart hypothesis. So basically this threw a massive spanner in the works that said, well, the higher your cholesterol goes, and by that I mean your total cholesterol number, the 6 or the 7 or the 5, and the higher your so-called bad cholesterol, LDL-C cholesterol goes, the lower your relative risk for poor cardiometabolic outcomes. So for heart disease, stroke, and so on. And we can explain this. I'll go into explaining why there's no association between LDL and total cholesterol. The main reason is because The markers that sit below that total number, more specifically your HDL cholesterol and your triglyceride numbers, are much better indicators of your risk of heart disease. So before we break that down, it's worth looking at what cholesterol is. So we have it in our heads, while cholesterol is this thing, like in the image, it's just this bad thing that clogs up your arteries. And nothing could be further from the truth. So you have to ask the question, if cholesterol is inherently bad for you, why does your liver make 75 to 80% of the cholesterol that's in your blood? Like, our bodies haven't come through 2.4 million years of human evolution to try and kill us. That's not the idea. You'd have hoped the creator, evolution, whoever you believe in, it doesn't matter. You would hope that that wasn't the case, that we didn't evolve for a couple of million years to make something that's just trying to clog up our arteries. That's definitely not the case. So 75 to 80% of the cholesterol that's in your blood right now is being made by your liver. Your liver is making it. The rest of it we get from food, and it comes from things like dairy products, eggs, meat, seafood, and so on. Now, the idea that consuming those foods would up our cholesterol level and that might be in somehow deleterious or harmful to our health is just not supported by the objective clinical literature at all. So cholesterol is actually really, really important. It's important for making cell membranes, vitamin D production. So when you go out in the sun and you get a tan, people say you get your vitamin D from the sun. You do. And the precursor for that and many other hormones around the body is dietary cholesterol and your own cholesterol. So without cholesterol, you couldn't make vitamin D, you would die. Without cholesterol, you couldn't make hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol, and you would die. You couldn't produce bile. You couldn't keep your cell membranes intact. Every single cell in the human body requires cholesterol, and you would die without it. So to just tarnish it with this cholesterol is bad and it's trying to kill us for some reason is just not true. So when we look at our cholesterol levels, it's really important to know the ones that are predictive of cardiovascular disease. So we know from this recent literature that total cholesterol is not predictive and LDL cholesterol is not predictive either. So the total cholesterol number, if it's over 5, doesn't necessarily confer or infer a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. In fact, it mightn't predict anything at all. Your LDL level also doesn't predict it. So LDL being higher than 3 or 4 does not confer or infer a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, what does is having low levels of HDL cholesterol, good cholesterol. So when you look at your HDL number in your cholesterol profile, this one is massively important. If it's above 1.3 at a minimum, you want it to be above 1.3. That's desirable. If it's above 1.5, that's great. So you want your HDL cholesterol in millimoles to be above 1.5. That's the ultimate goal. And you want your triglycerides to be below 1.8 at a minimum. These are bad triglycerides. I mean, broadly speaking, that's a bit reductionist, but they are bad. They're fats in the liver that are bad if they're at a high level anyway. So you want them to be below 1.8. And best case scenario, you want your triglycerides to be below 1. So ideally, you want your HDL, good cholesterol, to be higher than your triglycerides. And the way to do this is by eating less processed carbohydrate and sugar. And ironically, more of the other stuff like eggs and meats and cheese and fats and protein-based food. And that's because they're malleable under the action of a hormone called insulin. So insulin goes high, as you know from listening to me rabbiting on about it for the last few years. Insulin goes high when you eat processed carbs and sugar. And by the way, carbs and sugar are more or less one of the same thing. A bowl of porridge, 2 cans of Coke, 3 cream eggs, a big bowl of rice, they all end up as sugar in the blood because carbohydrates are essentially chains of glucose holding hands. So when you eat a high carb diet, eat a lot of carbs and sugar, your body's left with loads of glucose, your pancreas produces insulin, and insulin, which is the hormone that tries to lower your blood sugar levels, creates low HDL and high triglycerides, which is unfavorable in your cholesterol profile. So again, what you're looking for is you don't want to see a HDL, good cholesterol, below 1.3, and you don't want to see triglycerides above 1.7. And predictably, every single time, a low-carb diet will cause your triglycerides to go down, which is good, and your good cholesterol to go up, which is good. Oh, sorry, this didn't come across great on the particular streaming platform I'm using, but I mean, we have to ask the question. So forgive the titles being a bit all over the place. We have to ask the question, if the Inuit tribe, the Hadza, who are the other guys who eat lots of meat, the Maasai tribe, if they're eating almost exclusively red meat, internal organs and blood and fat and all that, where's the heart disease epidemic? Why don't we see it? Why is there no heart disease in these tribes? And others might say, well, they don't eat any processed food. That's correct. They might do a bit more exercise, hunting, and things like that. Not technically correct. The males in the tribe tend to do a lot of the hunting, and the females more traditionally take care of the kids and the home and things like that. So that doesn't explain that, because the females don't get heart disease or obesity either. The reason they don't get heart disease and obesity is because cholesterol and red meat do not drive heart disease. There's little or no evidence to say that they do. In fact, there's no evidence to say that they do. No concrete evidence at all. The main driver is processed food, and much of heart disease appears to be indicated in the data. The data appear to indicate that high blood sugar levels is the real catalyst for the high insulin levels that go on to cause heart disease. So this is a meta-analysis done on the whole saturated fat thing, and the largest ever meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is basically, so you've got trials, then you've got randomized controlled trials. You'll hear people referring to those as RCTs. RCT basically just means you take 1,000 people, you put them on a high-fat diet. You take 1,000 people, you put them on a low-fat diet randomly. You allocate them into random groups, and then you look at one group versus the other. So that's an RCT. And then a meta-analysis is an analysis of all of the randomized controlled trials. So the largest ever meta-analysis on saturated fat and heart health found conclusively that there is no significant evidence for concluding that saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, CHD, coronary heart disease, CVD, cardiovascular disease. So, and this has been found numerous times since. So the idea that, cheese or red meat or fatty, animal fats, butter, cream, any of that sort of stuff, dairy, would increase your risk of cardiovascular disease is not evident in the literature at all. Same thing for red meat. The possible absolute effects of red and processed meat on cancer mortality and incidence are very small, and the certainty of the evidence is low to very low, which is a very fancy scientific way of saying the idea that red meat causes cancer is based on dodgy epidemiological evidence from the 70s and the 80s. So the idea that red meat causes cancer, again, we don't see cancer in this tribe. There's little or no cancer in this tribe, and they eat exclusively red meat. So it appears that we've blamed saturated fat, red meat, salt, eggs, and dairy products for what essentially has been the work of the processed food industry. So the highly processed foods. And it kind of makes sense. So what does increase your risk of cardiovascular disease? Well, it's pretty obvious, actually, as we look at the literature. So this is a study done, I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago, that showed if you follow people over 30 or 40 years after they've had, this is middle-aged men, by the way, who'd had a heart attack. If you follow them for 40 years, so you get the 10,000 people in a group that have followed a heart attack, you onboard those and you follow them and you track their cholesterol levels, their blood pressure, their insulin levels, their blood sugar levels. What predicts a heart attack, a second heart attack over the next 40 years? So those in the group that had the highest total cholesterol of 8, 9, 10, really, really high, did not have an increased risk of having a second heart attack, contrary to the paradigm that we've listened to for the last 30 or 40 years. Having a high LDL level did not confer an increased risk of a second heart attack. Remember, LDL was thought as being bad cholesterol for a long, long time. Most people will still refer to it as bad cholesterol. Having high blood pressure doubled your risk for a second heart attack, and having high insulin levels. Now, this insulin, remember, comes from having high blood sugar levels, inferred a 6.7-fold increased risk of having a second heart attack. So if you had high blood sugar levels and high insulin levels, if you were diabetic or pre-diabetic, you were almost 7 times more likely to have a heart attack. So from this data appeared to indicate that total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol didn't actually increase your risk for heart disease, but having a high blood sugar and so high insulin level did. So if it were me with my kind of health science hat on, what would I be looking at to prevent heart disease and optimize my cholesterol levels? Well, I would certainly be looking at avoiding eating processed refined grains and cereals and foods that I know are going to increase my blood sugar levels. And by that, I mean breads, rice, pasta, granola bars, cereal bars, fizzy drinks, cakes, scones. God, I love scones. Scones, all that sort of stuff. I would avoid that. I would eat more meat, eggs, cheese, butter, cream, um, above ground vegetables like leafy green vegetables, cauliflower, broccoli, and so on. Um, and low sugar fruits like strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. I'd make sure I'm controlling my blood sugar levels, and I'd follow a lower carbohydrate, whole food diet that kind of stays away from the calorie controlled approach of things, where we eat highly processed, ultra palatable, refined foods, and we say that that's okay just because they're low in calories. We know that not to be the case now. So a really good way to sum this up, guys, is dietary cholesterol in and of itself is not at the root cause of heart disease. The data appear to indicate that high blood sugar levels that then cause high insulin levels appears to be at the root cause of heart disease. So based on what we know now over the last few years, and the data is overwhelming at this point, it's really, really solid. I would be choosing single ingredient foods and shopping on the outskirts of the supermarket. So think about that. If you go into your supermarket, your Dunnes, your Morrisons, I'm aware we've people listening in the UK as well, and maybe Canada. So shop in the outskirts. You want to have your meat, your eggs, your fish counters, your dairy, your fruits, your vegetables. All of that tends to be on the outskirts of the supermarket. And then when you go into the inner aisles, that's when you're in kind of processed food, dangerous kind of territory. Okay, I leave it at that for the moment, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you next week, and have a good one. Take care. Bye bye.